And I arrived in what was at that time a destroyed and very strange continent. During the war, I hadn't been much in occupied places. The islands had very few inhabitants except Japanese soldiers. I got to Nuremberg, and my first assignment was to read transcripts and collect procedural rulings, which I did for several weeks. I don't know if this is coming through. It seems like it's all static. Anyhow, I finally got assigned to a projected case which had been underway, at least in the investigation phases, for a long time. An economist at the Department of Treasury, Foster Adams, who some of you may know, had prepared a report on two German banks, the Deutsche Bank and the Dresdner Bank. And Russ Thayer was one of the people who was working on this matter. Rawlings Ragland was then assigned to it, and Herb Goldenberg. And the bottom of that staff was me. And I got interested in the case from the standpoint of its essential novelty. The subsequent proceedings, in my judgment, across the board, reflected an application of war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly, to all segments of German society. That was their primary function and interest. They didn't add much to the substantive law which had been announced by the IMT. I thought the banking cases were quite interesting, and I was happy to be assigned to them. I thought they were interesting from the standpoint that this did not involve conspicuous thugs and murderers. This was a case which involved an established and respectable institution of German society. In a certain sense, it was comparable to cases against German judges, cases against German doctors, cases against the industrialists, including Farben, and cases against a banker, it seemed to me, fit. In other words, the effect of a case like this was to establish that all segments of German society could be responsible for what happened. The first time I saw the defendants, I was kind of startled by their ordinary character. They were just people you could run into on any street in any city in the world. Nothing special about them. In the analysis of the case, we worked on both the Deutsche and the Dresdner case, and in particularly for the Deutsche Bank, we examined the activities of the chairman of the Vorstand, who was Hermann Ops. In the case of the Dresdner Bank, the chairman of the Vorstand was dead, and two members of the board had been SS officers. One was named Emil Meyer, the other was Karl Rasche. Meyer was also dead. That made the selection of an individual defendant rather simple. We were left with Karl Rasche. What is it that the bank could be charged with? Well, one of the documents we discovered with respect to the Dresdner Bank was an Aryanization report. It must have been 150, 200 pages long, which apparently was used by the Dresdner Bank to advertise its orthodoxy under the Nazi regime. The bank claimed to have been very active in securing, I think it was on the scale of 2 or 3 billion marks worth of Jewish property during its activities. And then, of course,
keep that thing up.
Yeah.
That's it.
And also claimed in the subsequent period to have been very instrumental in securing German ownership of Belgian, Dutch, Czech properties on a very large scale. We had similar material with respect to the Deutsche Bank, but it was scattered. This was a single volume report by Dresdner, which, if anything, may have exaggerated their accomplishments, but at least gave us in one place a long record of what they had engaged in. The basic charge brought against Dresdner was a spoliation charge, orthodox war crimes, plunder of, in some cases, its own citizens, but that wasn't much of a crime at Nuremberg, but plunder of Czech citizens, Jews and Gentiles alike, Dutch and Belgian, and that was what they were charged with. How did they do this? The Germans didn't like simply seizing properties without legal title, so they would generally secure the owners of the property in person. and if it was necessary, they would invoke the services of the Gestapo or the SD to persuade the owners of the property, the legitimate owners of the property, to convey title for very little or no cost. This was particularly true, for example, in one case involving Louis Rothschild, who was the head of the Rothschild family in Paris. That branch of the Rothschild family owned a steel rolling mill on the Czech-Polish border, which was very up-to-date, valuable, and modern. The Germans had, of course, seized it when they took Czechoslovakia, but they wanted title to it as well. They had Louis Rothschild in a hotel in Paris with a representative of the German Ministry of Economics, Hans Kirel, and the Gestapo. And under those circumstances, Louis Rothschild signed over his shares of stock in the Wittgenstein plant. He came out rather well. They actually let him get out of France to Switzerland. He survived the war. That was a major charge. A second charge was aiding in the financing of concentration camps with no interest or limited interest for the costs of construction. Ultimately, the charges of spoliation and plunder stood up in the court, convicted on that ground. They did not convict on the ground of low-interest loans for concentration camp building. That was considered a normal banking activity by at least our tribune. Among the other defendants I had were Rosh's counterpart in the Ministry of Economics, Hans Kirel, who was similarly convicted for participating in an overall program. As soon as he got out of jail, which was as soon as the trials ended, he went about his business. And years later, I saw him in the World at War series, commenting on how bad things had been during the Nazi administration. Of course, he was a high Nazi official. I also had a case somewhat linked against the vice president of the Reichsbank, who was Funkt assistant. He was the fellow who was in charge of the vaults that contained gold teeth, gold wedding rings, gold fountain pens, gold wristwatches, anything that could be taken off the corpses of concentration camp inmates. This was not a terribly difficult case. One of his defenses, of course, was he was not anti-Semitic, and not only that, he had also protected Jews. Simultaneously, he testified that as far as he was aware, Jews were not particularly persecuted. So the real question was, what was he protecting them from? Anyhow, he was sentenced also. The effect of these cases were the three people who I primarily were concerned with received sentences, and I can't narrate the order of them, of 5, 8, and 15 years. The real effect was Emil Kuhl of the Reichsbank ultimately became a member of the board of the Dresdner Bank. So I thought his time in the dock was well spent. He had made his connections during the trial. As to why McCloy did this, I have my own theories. The whole atmosphere of the subsequent proceedings was heavily under the influence of the Cold War, and there was not so much interest in whether Germans were ever convicted of crimes as in whether the Germans, at least the West Germans, would fall into our sphere of influence and whether they could be adapted as future allies. I think the Russian position in the East was exactly the same. In other words, by 1947, 1948, there was an atmosphere of pretty much, in many circles, let bygones be bygones, let's not bother the Germans particularly. Let them come to love us and join us. And in fact, the coverage of the trials by 1948 consisted very heavily of going through the proceedings with a view to anti-Russian or anti-communist statements made by the Germans. The Germans understood this, and they were not loath to make the point. In other words, the Germans seized upon what we learned to call the tu quoque argument, namely, we may have done some things that would not stand the light of day, but look at those Russians, look at those Russians. And I remember the New York Herald Tribune having a correspondent whose name was Edwin Hartridge, and looking at his stuff periodically, and what it basically had was no particular reporting of the trials with respect to Germans, but any anti-Soviet comment, whatever, was worth a headline.